Hello, my name's Tony Morbin, Executive News Editor at ISMG, and I'm your moderator for today's webinar. Our subject matter expert today is Chris Redband, Enterprise Identity Governance Advisor, Pathlock. Most identity governance platforms were built for a simpler era when access lived in isolated systems and governance meant periodic reviews. Today, access spans enterprise resource planning, human capital management, and SaaS applications, changes continuously, and introduces risk that traditional IGA tools struggle to detect and control in time. Today's webinar examines the key capabilities that define modern identity governance and why legacy approaches are no longer sufficient. We'll give a practical view of how organizations are evolving IGA to better manage access risk, improve visibility, and support continuous compliance. And that will include exploring cross-application risk correlation to uncover hidden segregation of duties conflicts, continuous policy-driven access reviews that replace static certification cycles, preventative controls embedded in provisioning to stop risky access before it's granted, context-aware access recommendations to reduce over-entitlement and enforce least privilege, and unified analytics and reporting for real-time visibility and audit readiness. Before we begin, for those of you unfamiliar with Information Security Media Group, we're a global education and intelligence firm with 38 international media sites in vertical sectors such as bank info security, gov info security, and healthcare info security, with more than 2 million members registered to our sites. If you have questions for our speaker during the course of this session, please submit them via the chat window on your screen. And if you experience any technical issues while viewing today's webinar, please use the email address on your screen. I also do need to emphasize the content being presented in today's webinar is copyrighted material and is meant for today's session and individual study purposes only. If you or your organization would like to use the information presented in today's session or looking for customized training or education, please contact us. Our sponsor, Pathlock, provides expertise in application security models, deep visibility into usage logs, and advanced activity monitoring. It delivers a unified, automated solution to reduce access risk and streamline controls across SAP and other critical systems. Designed to eliminate manual effort, Pathlock helps organizations enforce least privilege and maintain audit readiness while accelerating compliant access decisions. Now, back to our subject expert. Chris Redband, Enterprise Identity Governance Advisor at Pathlock, has more than 20 years' experience in identity governance and access control. He has held senior and principal solutions engineering roles at Quest Software, NetIQ, Micro Focus, and Savint, where he focused on automating cybersecurity checks and enforcing controls across business applications. At Pathlock, Chris works with large enterprises to strengthen access governance, reduce risk, and support secure, efficient operations. So, welcome, Chris.
Thanks very much. Good morning, Tony.
Great to see you. Now, identity first security is changing. Can you talk me through what's driving that change?
Well, I guess it's fair to say the world is a different place from what it was when identity and governance kicked off maybe 20 years ago, when it was very much an audit and compliance type requirement. But if we look at some of these kind of key topics that we see here, these are things that I see a lot, but they're also things that Gartner identify. So it's not just me; it's the entire market. And I guess if we just kind of just touch base on any of these just for a moment, but let's break them down and look how the market is now going way beyond just compliance requirements. So an explosion of apps. So wherever you look at the research, whether it's hundreds or even thousands of apps for companies, they require, especially fine-grained, high-risk apps, financially related apps, they require this kind of disproportionate oversight whereby you need full GRC tooling, which is equally commonly vendor-specific and therefore ends up in silos, and it becomes very difficult to manage. When we look at those hundreds or even thousands of apps, they will have things like inconsistent access models. They will have high risk, low risk, medium risk. They'll equally have these different constituent sets of users. So you may have some which are very niche but high risk. You may have some which are covered by thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of users, um, and you have to decide how you manage each of those. And of course, yeah, for each of those, you may well end up with a manual process or difficult integrations. And if that is the case and you can't onboard them, it becomes manual. Certifications, identity lifecycle, all these things become effectively, impossible or rubber stamped, etc. So when you used to have 10, you could manage that. Now you're talking hundreds or thousands. It is not possible. Things have to change. When we look at identities, though, equally identities used to be people, just a few people in a business. Then it became, over time, we started to include contractors, then externals, and now, of course, identities is no longer human beings alone. Identity is so much more than humans. So with we've always talked about service accounts, application accounts, and things, but NHI has completely changed the platform that we have to work with. So many times the number of users, identities as they may be, they're non-human. So that therefore leads to those management issues again. People come, identities come, they go equally as quickly. How do we manage those? Like I said previously, from an app perspective, whether we are provisioning those, deprovisioning those, importantly, re-provisioning those in the middle. How do we manage certifications of those? How do we manage analytics around those? Because the numbers are literally exploding, so to speak. But there's also the kind of concept of evolving threats. Now, breaches always, or it feels like they always are related to identity one way or another. And we've just talked about this kind of dynamic nature and the explosion of both identities and apps. So obviously what this does is it increases that attack surface, if you like, so that those evolution of threats and things like the problem with static roles rather than dynamic, things of not being risk aware, those threats just amplify at that point. And just kind of to tie that all up, actually, when we talk about new drivers, I started delivering identity security consulting around the year 2000. And at that point, everything was Sarbanes-Oxley related. And it really was a tick box exercise to get us through audit. And I see a lot that customers are here primarily for audit. But I'm seeing increasingly over time this move towards people doing it for the right reason as well. Because we're not just looking about audit anymore. It's a very important part, but we have to consider things like security outcomes and business enablement. So we are reducing risk, we are enabling the business at the same time, and those both have real value as well as the audit perspective. For example, a lot of customers are talking about ISO certification, for example, rather than just ticking those compliance boxes. So I guess the key point that I'm trying to bring home is managing identity, considering risk, is getting more and more difficult as the years move on.
Okay, so we're getting more difficult. What exactly are the problems, including access risks, associated with using legacy IGA models? And which capabilities would help organizations reduce their access risk across SAP, Oracle, Workday, Salesforce, and other critical systems in real time?
Sure. So, real time is a really key point there because, campaigns, audit, life cycle, all these things, they used to be, once a day, these kind of scheduled tasks, for example. And a lot changes in a 24-hour period nowadays as we're looking at these different types of identity, etc. And as we looked at those realities on the previous slide, I guess it hopefully highlighted a bunch of those inadequacies. So if we look at these options, so if we talk about things like manual and resource-heavy processes, now having people manually performing these tasks, things like identity provisioning, things like certification, things like access review, the human issue is often the problem. Not because it's deliberate, not because it's malicious, but because certainly nowadays it's very difficult to keep up with the pace of business. But if I take an example of this kind of the manual challenge, I spoke to a bank recently, a large UK bank, and they told me that it took them on average 7 days to have a new joiner join the business. Um, they also told me that because it took 7 days, people were stopping and starting doing things. What that meant was that by the time the user starts, not only have they probably waited 7 days, but there's about a 50% rate of rework required because that human nature of errors occurring, especially when you're dipping in and out. I've also heard other customers laugh at that 7 days because they say, actually, look, it takes us 30 days. I've also heard of large companies elsewhere taking up to 3 months to do it. So this challenge of of doing things manually, it is not practical anymore. It is slow and it is erroneous. Equally, when we look at things like yeah, certifications, access reviews, campaigns, whatever we want to call them, um, these often huge spreadsheets are impractical to manage. You will find when you do it this way that you'll get around a 99.9% approval of access because the reality is that nobody reads it. And even those good people who do read it, they don't understand it 'cause it just says this username, do we even know who that person is, has this AD group or whatever. And do we understand what that means? And human nature isn't then to question that and to research it. Human nature is to say, yeah, that's fine. I don't want to disturb the status quo. Um, and this is why the nature of human interaction is always a problem um, for identity, GRC, security, risk management. Anyway, enough on that one. So if we then look at kind of high risk apps, now as we talked about, these are very different from a basic kind of workforce application. Um, and what it means is they require much more management. Now, whether we talk about your ERPs, your SAPs, your Oracles, your Microsoft Dynamics, etc. of this world, complex HR apps, um, finance apps, anything with a fine-grained kind of entitlement structure becomes, I mean, these are the keys to the kingdom often. So these are business critical applications. So we have to have this significant oversight and this significant understanding, and often this speciality, which often also means it's a single application specific tool. Now, what that means is that you tend to end up with a silo at that point. And in that silo, you might have an expert or two who understand that application. But silos, of course, don't give you this kind of this control plane across the business. So when I'm trying to understand what's happening in my SAP or Oracle, for example, I have no context of what's happening in my Entra or my Salesforce, etc. So those silos become an absolute nightmare of blind spots and the significant risk. Um, and of course, what that tends to bring up is this kind of difficulty of keeping up with audits. Because if I've got silos for each of my apps, what it means is that that single control plane, compliance plane, whatever you want to call it, that single view doesn't exist. And as we talk later on about risk and things, we'll see how maturity is all about having cross-application risk and understanding that my SAP world, my Oracle world, and my Active Directory world, for example, they're all linked, right? So having those associated with one another and knowing that Chris has these 10, 15, 20 different accounts, it gives me the ability to look at Chris. What is Chris doing? Not what he's doing in one little place. And of course, the traditional audits and compliance reports, dashboards, spreadsheets, they're very much used in hindsight. They're not the way forward. Things like AI, talk to my data, etc. That will help me to do a lot around understanding what the actual answers are, not just a whole huge amount of data. And actually, just one thing I wanted to mention about high-risk apps as well that I forgot. High-risk apps often have this very complex entitlement structure. And we often talk about this kind of coarse-grained structure of entitlements. Beneath that, you will have a fine-grained set of entitlements, and this is where my SAPs, my Oracles, my transaction codes, my auth objects, all of these things exist. And then beyond that, you can get even more information when you look at doing things like continuous control monitoring. But in traditional kind of legacy IGA, what you tend to get is this coarse-grained access. Who's in a group? That's all we get. These high-risk apps have much more complex entitlement structures, which we need to understand to be able to deliver the final point to deliver audit, security, and risk-aware capabilities.
And how does cross-application risk correlation change the way that organizations approach segregation of duties controls?
Hmm. So when we look at this, I was just talking about silos. It's a good example. So your ERP is probably a silo. Um, Generally, ERP people, whether that's Oracle, SAP, Microsoft, etc., they do not talk to security people. Yeah, and 90% plus of customers, they don't speak. And what that means is that you've got an SAP or ERP team who understand exactly what's going on. And you've got a security team who understand exactly what's going on, but never the two paths shall cross. So if we imagine that my ERP team are managing my SAP and that my security team are managing everything else, well, my IT access might be fine and my SAP access might be fine when you consider them as a silo. But when you bring those two together and consider that control plane, you can see actually that Chris should not have this access in IT and this access in SAP because we're now seeing me as a human being and as identity, and we're able to correlate my access across all apps and therefore understand that perhaps I can get access to a business function in my ERP, fine. But then actually it turns out that I can also perform another business function in a second ERP or a second business critical application. Actually those things are entirely toxic, but you never know about it while they're not talking to each other. And really what that lack of visibility does is it's a potential playground for kind of internal fraud type challenges. So cross app down to coarse grained and even more of that. But then also translating those silos becomes super important. You will not see things like SAP uh, just using user and role. When you look at SAP, you get down to T codes, you get down to auth objects. Same thing with applications like Oracle, Dynamics, Salesforce, etc. All of these are the risk is in the fine detail and in the cross-app understanding.
Mhm. Now, you've gone some way to already answering my next question, but I'll ask anyway because you might have more to add. Many organizations still rely on quarterly or annual access reviews. Why is that no longer sufficient? And as I say, I do understand you've already partially answered that.
Well, so when customers ask me about this, and what we have to remember is that a lot of customers, they don't live and breathe this. So there's the kind of this view that actually quarterly is fine because it's an audit kind of discussion, right? However, I always like to think about it in this way. If let's say that I did a certification campaign, I do it quarterly, and let's say that I'm actually a really good reviewer, and that I actually do look at it, I use all the information available, and I make a sensible decision. Brilliant. But that was on the 1st of February. And it's a quarterly process. So actually, the reality is that it's another 3 months pretty much until I review that access again. Now, if one of my team or someone who I'm vaguely in the approval flow for changes access today, the 4th of February, the reality is 3 months until that's checked again. Now, perhaps my user got the right access in the right way at the right time. Equally, perhaps they didn't. So actually what I'm ending up with 3 months of a blind spot. Now, this user's got this access, but I don't find out until the end of the quarter. So I can't resolve it at that point. So even with the best will in the world, that leaves massive gaps. So there's then this movement towards kind of continuous monitoring, let's say, continuous detection and the ability to manage that risk, but also that entitlement creep. Because if I change job, for example, I move, let's say, from marketing to sales, commonly I might keep my marketing access for a couple of weeks and then move into sales. and lose that marketing access. Now, there may be toxic risk in between having those two departments that may be mitigated for a couple of weeks. And with proper tooling, proper logic, it's very easy to say that after 2 weeks, I lose my old access. However, the reality is that where you're using a traditional tool, or what I still see a lot of customers do, writing things in diaries, um, that old access is never going to get revoked. This is your permission creep, and this is with the best will in the world, lovely people potentially getting more action they should do and accidentally doing things they shouldn't do. So yeah, that move towards triggered or risk-based, kind of almost real-time notifications, campaigns, risk management is the way to manage any gaps that exist.
Mhm. And what role do preventative controls play in modern IGA approaches?
Well, so I mean, it depends on um, your view of modern IGA, I guess, but Pathlock in particular, I think, delivers this great value to the market, right? Because preventative and the interpretation and the understanding of risk stops it from happening in the first place. And what I mean there is very much during access requests, during potentially identity lifecycle tasks, these kind of traditional JML tasks that go ahead and blindly grant you access because the logic says so. We will check that, or a tool should check that, and so look, actually, look, it says you're a salesman, the VP of sales, for example, because HR have put that in. Because it's a very senior role with a lot of access, do we actually want to check that in a preventative fashion before automatically giving you that? So these kind of traditional identity lifecycle rules, they need to rethink and a little bit of a check to make sure that there isn't potential significant over provisioning going in there. But often when we talk about preventative controls, what people are really asking about is this kind of access request process. Now, access request tends to come in a number of different ways. Of course, you can do it through the end user portal of an IGA tool. Um, Increasingly so, you can do it through things like ServiceNow. You can do it through things like Microsoft Entra. Um, and all of these kind of have different challenges, if you like, to them because, yeah, ServiceNow and Entra aren't really made for fine-grained, risk-aware requests, etc. So one has to inject that information into it. Of course, an IGA tool is made to perform that task as well. So when we look at it from an IGA perspective, from the Pathlock perspective, or from any kind of enterprise modern approach, preventative is all about saying, at the time of requesting access, let's check that risk. Now, if I check that risk at that point, and I do it in a human-friendly way, because remember, we're talking to end users, managers, we're not talking to application administrators. If I say, look, first of all, I'm going to guide you to what you might like to request. So I'm going to suggest things based upon you, upon your peer group, upon your usage, etc. And of course, things which are low risk and things which don't represent an SOD or a risk to me as a user identity. So recommendations engines are very important, but also making those, just things like what am I requesting? Do it in human terminology with descriptions, friendly explanations, etc., risk calculators, and so on, so that I understand what I'm requesting. And if I request a few things across a few different apps, represent to me whether that is a good idea or not. Because I often see that when a user goes through, they think they've requested this, this, and this, and they think it's correct. They'll get to this kind of checkout page, and it will say, look, what you're trying to do will create an SOD, it will create this risk, etc. And my view, of course, is that risk is necessary in the business. It is how you manage that risk which is important. So we have to be able to mitigate that risk when it's appropriate. But obviously, we don't want to encourage that risk in the first place. So when we get that kind of checkout, I see one or two things happen. Number one is that my user understands because it's in human format. They understand what they're seeing, and often they will go back and they will change their request because they realise that actually they've done something daft. So this kind of intelligence literally prevents them even from submitting that problem request. Of
Mhm.
course, the other thing is if they say, look, I know I am the outlier, I do need this access, and they will often then, when it comes to adding comments, adding justification, etc., their justification will be significant, and then of course the routing of that request will go off to appropriate approvers based upon what you're seeing. But preventative rather than detective is obviously all about saying, helping me to avoid that risk in the first place. And then if it does have to be requested, submitting that to appropriate flows, not a single generic flow, the appropriate flows of approval and mitigation. And like I said, when we look at things like ServiceNow, when we look at things like Entra, in fact, when we look at things like traditional IGA tools, um, you can overlay capability onto those so that you can still perform the request through them, but that you can request the risk calculation and ingest it back into those tools to help you to give a sensible, risk-aware approach, even where the business has decided they're going to use that UI for request.
Okay, so you've explained there that we obviously need to also wherever risks involved, we have to deal with the context, and so you've looked at it from a contextual point of view, and you also covered the fact that over entitlement, like you say, the job changer suddenly retains their previous access. I mean, over entitlement is a persistent problem. Why are organizations still finding it so hard to fix?
Um, I think there are kind of two reasons. I think number one is probably the fact that there is rarely really a link between HR, human resources, whatever, and IT. Nobody really tells IT what's happening. Um, and what that leads to is, if we don't know, we can't fix it. Now, of course, analytics and things help us to identify whereby we have users who are inactive, for example, and we can say, well, actually, should they still be have this access? We can see in those periodic certifications, what do we do? But they're all with hindsight, which is suboptimal, obviously. Um, and the challenge you often have is that these are potentially risky accesses they have, potentially expensive licenses they have, but generally I would suggest that it is a lack of communication, because the lack of integration with other apps, etc. And sometimes one has to consider, this kind of the analogy of a traveler, right? Now, a traveler might have a passport, and that's going to to register when they go into a country. However, it doesn't then register what they do in that country, where they go, and even what they do within that country. So having that context and that risk aware element helps me to understand what they're doing, when they're doing it, and actually if they're even doing it anymore. So it's another element that helps me to see, should I be resolving that? But communication really, and triggers from authoritative sources, HR apps, etc. That link does need to exist. And often when you look at these product projects, um, yeah, it's the it's bringing people on board, uh, HR, application owners, etc., which is key to success with projects like these.
Hmm. Okay. Now, let's get to the crux of it. We've talked about five capabilities. So, how does a modernized IGA solution differ architecturally and operationally from traditional legacy systems? What are these five capabilities that you're saying we need? And also, does this new approach scale with business change?
Yeah. So, I mean, architecturally, the days, if you like, of on-premise implementations, other than very, very few exceptions now, are lost in history now. Yeah, primarily because when we start to do things via SaaS, um, scalability becomes really important, flexibility becomes really important, but it also allows things like the delivery of security updates, but also capability updates. If you look at the likes of Microsoft or Salesforce, for example, it's all about delivering updates in an efficient fashion so that users get updates without any effort involved. And of course, it allows you to manage the security that is associated with that. So, yeah, the cloud has changed quite a lot in the way we do things. Um, but when I look at kind of what modern IGA should be, um, it's the opposite of that slide we showed earlier, right? Um, and really, when we talk about kind of smart automation, so before we talked about these challenges of manual processes, etc. But the reality is that as we move to automation where appropriate, um, it means that my identity lifecycle is automated, but with checks within it. It means that things like my access reviews are performed in a timely fashion. And when I say a timely fashion, I mean specifically, some things I want to review within an hour. Some things I want to um, automatically allow things that haven't changed. Other times I want to perform a full campaign because it's perhaps the audit cycle, for example. So you have this challenge that you often see of kind of user fatigue, approver fatigue, certifier fatigue. And what that means is that the more work they're having to do, um, they stop really concentrating on it. So where we automate all of these processes as much as sensible, it means that when those approvers, certifiers, etc., actually get a task to perform, they actually concentrate on it. So you get much better results from those actors, those certifiers. And of course, that extends into this kind of business PAM concept as well. So kind of firefighter type capability, but looking at where I want to allow someone, for example, to go and get access to my SAP world, my Ariba world, my Oracle Dynamics worlds, etc. If I want to go and give them access, let's automate that process in what they can have, what they can do, but also the visibility, and this alludes to one of the other topics, the visibility in what they can actually do and how that differs from what they've done, and therefore audit reporting. Because although we said earlier on, a lot of this is now about good practice, of course, auditability is absolutely key to understanding who's done what from an audit and or good practice fashion perspective. So it allows us to recognize urgency when we need to, it allows us to automate when we need to, and all those stories I told earlier about rubber stamping, about the time it takes to do things, about people not performing kind of mover or lever topics correctly. Automation can take those challenges away. It can allow you to take those humans and actually put them on work that humans need to do rather than automatable tasks.
Okay, so talk me through how that actually works in practice. I mean, an organization comes along to Pathlock and says, I want to modernize my IGA program. How do you address the issues for your clients to ensure that they're going to be audit ready?
Yeah, sure. So Pathlock has a lot of audit staff on staff as well. So when we look at this, we understand not only the applications, but from the audit perspective as well. So what that allows us to do is it allows us to deliver controls-based capability that auditors will accept and what auditors will appreciate. But when we look at kind of Pathlock's application governance capabilities, it fits into 5 kind of key topics. You can see here a whole bunch of applications, lots more fine-grained, and in fact, we have the greatest number of application supported both from a breadth and depth. And the depth is often the important one based on what we've talked about so far. Understanding actually what is happening at those super fine-grained levels in things like Salesforce, Ariba, Dynamics, etc. Yeah, these become really, really critical. So you can go and find those online, but lots and lots of connectors to a very fine-grained level. But kind of the five key topics that we look at here and the ones that we've kind of talked about as we've gone through. When we talk about access risk analysis, it's all about those things like preventative SODs we talked about, preventing risk in the first place. So not just multiple site toxic combinations, but sensitive access, critical access, etc. So when we're doing that, it's fair to say that I suppose the risk insight is embedded everywhere. As we talked about earlier, giving that risk in that context allows users to do the right thing. And then if we look at things like compliant provisioning, identity lifecycle, joiners, movers, leavers, whatever we want to call it. So compliant provisioning is all about policy-based granting of access to users as they join and then move through and potentially rejoin the business. So that, it's policy-based, logic-based, etc. But as I said, it's important to consider the compliant element there because you'll find that blindly following policy isn't always the best thing for risk. So once again, that risk insight is going to be embedded within compliant provisioning. Is it the right thing to do? If it looks like it might not be, let's just take a beat and check whether that is the right thing to do. As we move around, we'll look at certifications. So we talked about how these need to be in an appropriate and timely fashion. Now that makes sense perfectly, and it should be users, roles, anything concerned that should be automatically checked. But context and the risk associated with that is really important. So things like usage. Now you'll find a few products on the market that will deliver things like peer analytics, etc. And that makes up part of the picture. But things like usage, you'll also find if I discover that I've got my user that I'm looking at reviewing my identity, they have these applications. Now, you may discover it's risky, you may discover it's got SODs in it, and you may discover that none of their peer group has that access. Now that looks like it is something you use to revoke. The reality, though, is that you then see when you look at usage, no, actually this user does use this a lot. Now at that point, you might as well actually know, hang on, that user is a special case. They're perhaps a finance person in a small office, and they do have to perform both sides of the request and approve, or the request and receive type tasks. So context and usage is really valuable to make those certifications more complete. Role management. So roles, become very powerful things because you might give a finance role to 1,000 people. So as soon as you have that role, if you put risk into that role, it's going to be the case that you've put risk into 1,000 people's roles. So tools like risk simulation and analysis before you build the roles, before you provision the roles, is super important. So it's not just about putting a couple of pieces of access together, calling it a business role or an enterprise role or cross-application role, and giving it to somebody. It's that simulation that's super important to actually understand the risk that might be involved in it. And then finally, if we look at elevated access management, we call it business PAM commonly. It is what it says on the tin, really, but even more so. So, how do you request that privileged access? And of course, those flows and approval processes should be very different based upon who you are. I've worked for companies whereby the help desk guy, the front desk security guy, and the domain admin could get the same access in the same way. Now that obviously isn't appropriate, but once you've got that access through an appropriate fashion, it's about monitoring the access, of course enforcing the controls, but after that, it's about delivering sign off, approval, and audit logs in an audit ready fashion, which actually allow the auditor to do what they need to do, rather than perhaps watching a 3 hour video or something with the benefit of hindsight. So uh, we'll also look at things like AI, which will allow me to review and even ask why have you done this, for example. So hopefully, as we've walked through, that's given you some ideas about why Pathlock's different. But one thing I just wanted to touch on as well, um, even beyond Pathlock's IGA and GRC capabilities we've talked about today, yeah, we also have continuous controls monitoring capabilities that go beyond even that coarse grain and fine grained capability. Um, we've got things like cybersecurity application controls and dynamic access controls. So what we often find is that customers actually they want to do even more than IGA because IGA plus GRC is very common, but we also see a lot of customers want to complete their requirements with additional tools, and sometimes that's a maturity curve. Sometimes it's just different business processes, but everything is there for the kind of modern enterprise.
Yeah. Now I've got a couple of questions coming in,
Okay.
but I'm going to combine them because we're running out of time. Now, I need to modernize my IGA solution. What should I be asking a potential supplier? Why should I choose Pathlock? And why shouldn't I just enhance what I've already got? I've got Microsoft Dynamics. Why don't I just enhance that?
Okay. So if we talk about Microsoft, for example, so Microsoft Entra, Identity Governance, or even Microsoft Dynamics, the ERP, that those applications uh, don't work cross-application. They don't deliver the fine-grained nature required. And what that means, of course, is that you lose kind of risk awareness. It's the same when you look at other identity solutions. So we bring those together and we can ingest and deliver risk back to those if you choose. Or of course, we're very happy to, and we do commonly replace those, but politics often mean that you can't be seen to kill that other investment. So that's one element. But the other part is, when you're talking to an IGA vendor, you need to be looking at, think about, are you worried about, is your primary worry about your basic workforce apps, or is your primary worry really about these kind of core financial applications? Now, vendors like Pathlock can deliver both of these, but what you need to bear in mind is that where you have a vendor that primarily focuses on the kind of workforce apps, but can do a bit of the fine-grained, clever stuff. What that often means is that you have to do a huge amount of consultancy work around it to deliver things like controls, analytics, reporting, etc., to actually go and pass those audits, to pass those ISOs, to do the best practice stuff. Pathlock delivers the widest and deepest, in fact, set of connectors, but also more to the point, kind of we call it content. So things like mitigating controls, things like SOD matrices, etc. So what that results in is all about time to value and kind of total cost of ownership and things, so that you can get your apps onboarded easily and you can control them easily. And then, of course, doing that easily and quickly means that your cost of ownership just plummets.
Well, excellent. Thank you, Chris, for sharing your insights and expertise today.
Thank you.
And thanks also to our sponsor, Pathlock. I also want to thank you for taking time out of your day to attend the session. And I trust that today's discussion has provided some useful data points to enable your organization to address modernized IGA and also to understand the 5 capabilities closing gaps in traditional identity governance. We hope to see you again at one of our upcoming events. For Information Security Media Group, I'm Tony Morbin, and thank you once again, Chris.